Well, I guess I will go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to Wellesley. For those of you who are first-time visitors, especially welcome. For those of you who are returning perhaps for a second, third, or more time, welcome back. I apologize for it not being a sunnier, nicer day today, but my sources tell me tomorrow is supposed to be a very lovely day. So hopefully a great day to walk around campus and experience the beauty of Wellesley a little bit more. But what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is actually one of the newest initiatives Wellesley has undertaken. A movement, or at least the initial steps into the realm of online education. Now, given that all of you are in some ways connected, or at least fairly close to students who are of a college age, you have probably heard something about the rise of MOOCs, massive open online courses. If you follow higher education literature, the New Yorker, the New York Times, any of these publications, over the last year, you've seen a lot of articles about the rise of MOOCs, the expansion of online teaching as a new realm in the frontier of higher education. And Wellesley has entered into that this year, joining a partnership with edX that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. And I'm actually the first faculty guinea pig involved in the project in the sense that I'm teaching Wellesley's first online class, An Introduction to Human Evolution, which is why the title slide here is of a fossil that I'll talk about in a little bit. But when you found out that your daughter or friend or cousin or niece was coming to Wellesley, this was probably the image you had in mind, our beautiful campus. And this is what it will look like in a week or two from the other side of the lake. And again, tomorrow, if it's nice, you should walk around the lake so you can have this view. But you probably imagined your daughter in a classroom like this. A group of, say, 10 to 15 young women sitting around a table, intellectually curious and asking each other questions, developing knowledge in the kind of seminar-style setting that we tend to associate with liberal arts education. And I have to say, I love this kind of education. If I could, I would go back and just relive my graduate years and the graduate seminars I had over and over again because of how enriching this environment is. The small seminar classroom, where everyone is engaged in the topic, everyone has valuable ideas to contribute, and you don't know entirely the direction the class is going to go because you don't know what everyone's going to contribute. So given this, why would you want to submit your daughter to a classroom like this? One in which instead of 15 people sitting around a table, you have thousands of students. And I will say, it is free. But I will say, though, that Wellesley's first online class debuted Wednesday morning, this past Wednesday at 7 a.m. And it has 19,000 students registered for it. So I'll talk more about exactly where those students are coming from, but it's a significant contrast between the class I'm teaching on campus. Because I'm teaching an Introduction to Human Evolution class on campus as a seminar. It has 14 students in it. There's about 1,400 students in the online class for every one student in the on-campus course. It's a very different environment. So why would we want to do this? What's the advantage to your daughter or your niece or your granddaughter in taking a class in this kind of environment? What is the value for Wellesley College to engage in this kind of environment? Wellesley College is a small liberal arts college. That's its brand. That's what it does. Why would it want to try something so radically different? What does it have to add to the process? And what does that process have to potentially add to Wellesley College? That's what I'd like to talk with you a little bit about today. So to give you a little bit of background, about a year ago, Wellesley decided to partner with edX, edX being a nonprofit that was initially started in collaboration between Harvard and MIT. Since that time, it added as a major partner UC Berkeley. And since that time, it's added in a number of other major universities around the world, actually, most recently expanding into several institutions in China. Wellesley partnered with it last fall, and at the time became the first liberal arts college to partner with this. And being the first liberal arts college raised some interesting questions. Again, these questions of what is the advantage for the liberal arts college? How does it take that model and expand it into the online classroom? Before I taught here at Wellesley College, I taught at the University of Michigan. And my classrooms there were classes of 150 to 500 people. They were big auditorium classrooms where my primary job was to put together the course materials and give 2 90-minute lectures a week. In that context, translating that to an online environment is much more easy, much more readily available than transferring a seminar environment to an online class. It's the same kind of process in some ways. So it's an interesting question as to what exactly Wellesley has to offer to this process, and what advantages does this partnership have to offer to Wellesley College, its students, and its alumni. So how can we use technology to make the Wellesley College classroom better? So ideally, we're entering in this partnership primarily to improve the education that your daughter or granddaughter or niece or friend is experiencing here at Wellesley. That's our first and primary mission. But the second question is how can we use this technology to expand the mission of the college, to do more things with the tremendous resources we have here at Wellesley College? We have 400 faculty members all engaged in intensive production of knowledge across a whole host of topics. All of us feel very passionately that those topics we're exploring are important and valuable. The more we can share them, the more we can share the knowledge we produce out of these classes, the better Wellesley will be achieving its mission in the world. So these are the questions we had to ask. And these are the questions that I was asking myself when I agreed to be the person to test this process, create Wellesley's first online class. And so when I was putting these ideas together, I had several goals in mind for what I had in mind for this class, Anthropology 207. This is a class I've taught on campus twice before this semester. It's an introduction to human evolution, primarily focused on the human fossil record, but including considerable discussion of human genetics, archaeology, and our understandings of human behavioral evolution through time. It's a class that I haven't been entirely excited about how I've taught in the past. It's a huge amount of content. And for most undergraduate students, it's content that's entirely new to them. Maybe they've seen a Discovery Channel program or watched National Geographic. But for the most part, actually going in and studying the fossil record in great detail is entirely foreign. So when I started teaching this the first couple times, it was primarily me lecturing in front of a class, going through a lot of information, presenting it fossil by fossil, and having the students ingest that information. But I found that dissatisfying. It wasn't really what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to do more with the class, to more effectively deliver that content to the students, which was one of the reasons I was interested in trying it out for Wellesley's first WellesleyX course. Also, as you may or may not be aware, evolution, particularly human evolution, is fairly controversial. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 45% of Americans don't accept evolution. That's something on the order of about 100 million people, depending on how you do the math. So I was interested in creating online and open resources that could potentially be used at both primary and secondary levels of education. I have my oldest brother as a high school science teacher in Alaska, and ever since I started grad school, I've always done an online conference with his class where we basically discuss human evolution in connection with a human evolution unit that he teaches his students. So I'm kind of the expert in the field. But if I can do that with one class, why not do it with apparently 19,000 students? So trying to put together these goals, I had several things in mind. The first was to take advantage of the platform afforded by edX to create more of a flipped class environment. Instead of having so much of the class time spent me talking, offsourcing some of that talking to people's laptops so that they can watch me back at home in their dorm room as opposed to having to listen to me in the classroom. So we produced a huge amount of video lectures that they can watch at any time. We also moved a lot of those readings into outside of the classroom. This has allowed us to do more in the classroom. Today, for example, we had the class actually this morning, and we were filming the class and we were filming a debate between the students in the class as to what particular genera of fossil represented the earliest hominins, the earliest fossils on the human lineage after the split with our last common ancestors, those associated with the African great apes. Now, this is the kind of free-form classroom activity that I've been hard-pressed to do the last two times I taught the class because of the limited time available and the large amount of content I wanted to deliver. So I've been able to use the edX platform to make more of that content available to students 24/7 outside the classroom and do more with the time inside the classroom. I also have been able to add a sort of virtual lab component to the class. I don't have the resources on campus to actually have the students engage in a full-scale physical lab on campus, but I can create a virtual lab online that gives them more opportunity to do more creative things with the actual fossils and the primary data we use to create knowledge about human evolution. So I'm happy to do these two things, but these two things by themselves aren't necessarily revolutionary. The flipped classroom idea has been around for a long time and has been very popular in lots of circumstances. But I also wanted to do more. One is that I wanted to develop a unique environment in which Wellesley students, current Wellesley students, might interact with actually Wellesley alums. In the last 2 days, I've spent a fair amount of time on the introductory discussion forums for my class, and it's exciting to see so many alums actually say, I'm a Wellesley alum, and I've been waiting to have an opportunity to reconnect with the academic community ever since I graduated. and to have students have the chance to actually connect with alums from the same institution in the same kind of classroom environment, I think is an amazing and potentially very unique experience that Wellesley has to offer to its students. It's one thing to say, oh, we took the same art history course. I took it in 1964, and you're taking it now in 2013. But it might be the same course in title, but clearly it's not the same course. If you took a human evolution course here in 1964, it would be wildly different than a human evolution course here in 2013. So now you have the opportunity to share in the same content associated with that class in a really different kind of way. I also, as I said, wanted to create an open access resource for teaching human evolution. I also have had lots of teachers in my class, I can already tell. I've also actually had a bunch of, and this has been a surprise to me, there are a lot of high school homeschool students enrolled in my class, which is interesting to see. Again, so using Wellesley's resources to leverage that to create teaching materials for bettering society. Obviously, part of Wellesley's goal in doing the WellesleyX is to create an image for Wellesley, to brand it in a certain way, to say that Wellesley can take its outstanding teaching credentials and translate them into a different environment, and even gear them potentially to prospective students. One of our goals in the video production associated with the class has been to film in a lot of different locations. And if any of you are in the class, actually, you'll see that we film all over campus. We film in my office, in classrooms, in labs, but we film by the lake, by the boathouse, we film in the academic quads, we filmed all around campus, and even actually in a number of locations around Boston. So we're showing off Wellesley in many kinds of ways. But then finally, I really wanted to try and leverage the properties of the MOOC to make the massive open online class, to make our on-campus class better, and to simultaneously leverage those properties of our on-campus class to make that online course better. So to do that, I've done a number of different things, which I'll sort of outline the general structure for right here. In putting together this course, and this process started really back in May, and ideally probably it would have started back like a year ago May, because it is a bit time intensive. But the background has been creating a lot of high quality video lecture content ahead of time, coupled into an integrated course structure, outlining basically the entire development of the course. These are primarily sort of 5 to 15-minute video segments, again, filmed in a lot of different places so that the background varies, the setting varies. We filmed at a zoo, we had chimpanzees in the background, at one point a lion started roaring. I have to say it's pretty good video, I think. I think it's very high quality video. It's not just a video of me standing at a podium talking for 60 minutes at a time. That may or may not be entertaining. Hopefully it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's probably not what I want to expose 19,000 students to do for 12 weeks in a row. So that's been the background, and this is video that I've used for both the online course and the on-campus course. Our on-campus course, I should say, started about 3.5 weeks ago. And I've been able to use that on-campus course to actually do beta testing of the online course components. So before making this stuff go live to an audience of 19,000, I've been able to test and make sure everything works in front of an audience of 14 students. They can help inform basically how good is the product that I'm producing. What little tweaks and technical adjustments do I need to make it work better and well? This week, 3.5 weeks sort of later, that online course started, and again with 19,000 students Wednesday morning. Now, part of the way in which I'm trying to use the on-campus course to make that online course better is to use targeted in-class video capture to help seed the content of this online course. I want the students in my online course to see what our students do, to hear the kind of conversations to have, to hear the thoughts they have, the discussions they have. So again, this morning my students were debating which of these different genera should be the earliest hominin, which has the strongest case to make. We filmed that in the hopes that we might be able to condense that down into, say, a 30-minute segment that might serve as the beginning for an online discussion. So what our students are doing on campus might help initiate a conversation between 5,000 students online, coming from a whole host of different backgrounds. So that's one step of the process, and we're doing this about 6 to 7 times in the semester, targeting specific activities in the classroom that we think will be productive and produce engaging conversation and dialogue between our students to help provide that kind of discussion, that kind of environment for our online students. The second thing has to do with the advantages of an online class, and specifically as it relates to human evolution, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. But I've been able to take these online students and use them as a way of understanding what human patterns of variation look like. 19,000 students, as you might guess, is a much more diverse group than 14 students. And I'm going to go through that in some detail before. But I will be able to take that variation from my online class and use it to create teaching materials for the on-campus class. And again, I'll come back to this point very shortly. There are open discussion forums, which again, in the 2.5 days they've been active, have been incredibly active, that our students can participate in. So that it's one thing to talk amongst yourselves in a group of 14 in the class, but they can engage with a whole host of students who are in the online class as well. Engage in the conversations, the discussions. There are 800 PhDs enrolled in my course, which means there's a lot of knowledge there within that group of 19,000 that the students can take advantage of. They don't need to rely on just me and my PhD. There are a lot of other options available to them in these courses, and a lot of other potential of generating really interesting conversations and dialogues. And then finally, we can use the online platform to do really systematic assessments of actually how people are engaging with the content, how they're watching the videos, what are they getting out of it, what points are they struggling with, both in the online classroom and the on-campus classroom. Now, my on-campus students aren't being graded in the online setting. They're being graded in different ways possible. I'm giving them essays and different kinds of activities that are a little bit more personal. They're not getting the same kind of assessment. So it's not the same course, but it's using much of the same content. Now, specifically, the reason I wanted to do this in a class of human evolution is that understanding fossils is fundamentally about taking individual specimens and trying to reconstruct where they fit in within patterns of biological variation. This was the start of my dissertation project. These are 4 specimens from the site of Dmanisi, Georgia, a site that's 1.8 million years of age. It's the earliest fossil human site out of Africa, dated earliest Homo erectus, if you want to go with that terminology. But when I first started working there as a grad student, this was what the hominin sample from the site was like. This was the sample of fossil humans. There were 2 mandibles, 2 lower jaws, and 2 partial skulls. Now, I was fortunate that in the years I worked there as a graduate student, we were able to extend that sample significantly. But nevertheless, the challenge was to, in my case for my dissertation, understand the pattern of variation in these jaws. Why are they different? How do we explain this variation? And the way we do that is by understanding contemporary patterns of variation and using them as comparative analogs. So I went out and measured lots of human jaws in museum collections, lots of ape jaws, and lots of fossil hominin jaws in museum collections in Kenya and South Africa and Ethiopia and Israel and all over Europe and a number of other locations. When I'm trying to teach students about human evolution and how evolution works, I oftentimes rely on the variation within our class. So I'll ask students questions. For example, most of us are familiar with the Da Vinci drawing of I always forget the exact name of it, the Vitruvian Man, where he's in the box and the circle around him. And you can take that drawing and you can imagine it's a hypothesis for human limb proportions, where basically your wingspan is equal to your height if you look at the dimensions of the box that Da Vinci has drawn out there. And that's a hypothesis that we could test in our class. We could actually have students stand up and measure their wingspan and their height and actually see whether they fit the pattern predicted by that drawing. And that's a way we can take living patterns of biological variation and use them to understand how we might ask questions and test hypotheses in the fossil record. But again, in a sample of 14 students, and we have fairly diverse students, but even still, 14 students only gives you so much variation. 19,000 students gives you a lot more variation to work with. So one of my goals for making this a successful class was to take advantage of that property. What kind of class would you like to teach with a huge audience? One in which you're interested in the variation of that huge audience. So what does my on-campus and online class look like? So if you go into the platform for edX, actually this is basically what it will look like. So here's me giving the introductory lecture to the course. Perhaps your daughter or granddaughter or niece lives in Tower Dorm, in which case you might recognize this as Tower Court. But basically there's a lot of content set up there for them to go through, various assessments. Again, one of the goals was to create an online lab component to the class. So next week online, the students will be introduced into human and ape skeletal anatomy. So this is an exercise trying to get them to know the bones of the skull, both on a human and, in this case, a male gorilla. But again, activities that are hopefully engaging but provide a lot of good and organized direct content for students to engage with. But the differences between the Wellesley College class and the WellesleyX class in terms of the students is kind of interesting to look at. And I just started actually putting together this information on Wednesday when the class really went live. And one of the differences, of course, is we have male students in the class. A little more than half, as it turns out. That in and of itself isn't necessarily so interesting. More interesting, for example, is if we look at the age at birth of the students in my online class. This represents about 17,000 of the now 19,000 students in the class. But you can see people are born from a very large range here. The oldest self-reported age or year of birth was 1921 in the class as of Wednesday, middle of the day. The youngest was 2004. Aside from a couple of people who put 2013, who I think were lying. I don't think I have an infant at home, and I don't think he's ready to take the class. But compare this to my on-campus course, and the class is a little bit older. Here's where my on-campus students sit. So it's interesting to look at this variation. For example, if we look again at this distribution, we have people like this person in the class, this being actually my dad, born in 1947. We also have my oldest brother, that high school science teacher from Alaska, born in 1973. But again, one of the goals for the class is to set up potentially unique environments where students might engage with Wellesley alums. You might recognize Hillary Clinton there, class of 69, or Heidi Hawkins, international mountaineer, class of 89. It's a potential, I don't think in this case that Hillary Clinton is in my class, but it's the potential that she could be in my class, that any Wellesley alum could be in my class and could meet Wellesley students and say, hey, I took that Introduction to Human Evolution course, and have the experience of saying, I took the same course, or at least a course built off of the same basic content. So we're creating a shared experience between Wellesley students and Wellesley alums, or at least the potential for that kind of shared experience. Other things about my online course audience. As I said, I have more than 800 PhDs in the class. And if we look at this distribution, we see some interesting things emerge. There's a lot of high school and even junior high school students in the class. Again, I said I was surprised by how many people introduced themselves as homeschooled high school students when I started going through the discussion forums on Wednesday. But if we look at this in general, most of the students are more highly educated, or at least have a higher degree of educational certification than our students on campus. Most of them have already graduated college, if not graduate schools or other kinds of advanced educational opportunities. And then this is just a map that I just started putting together from gleaning information out of the contents, the discussion forums, basically who said where they were from. I didn't even go through the technical data about geolocation on our students. But this was just in the first few hours, basically, where students commented from, where they were coming from. And again, I knew the class was going to be big. I knew there were a lot of students. I knew it would have a global audience. But I have been blown away by exactly how global that is. And what it means like when those students actually start talking, start introducing themselves, start saying where they're coming from, the background they're bringing in, why they're interested in taking a class on human evolution. So when we think about these differences, on average, at least on the surface from the first 3 days of the class, the WellesleyX student body is a little bit older, a little bit more highly educated, and quite a bit more diverse than our Wellesley students, giving me a tremendous opportunity to draw on that variation to help teach our students about how evolution works, but also giving our students a very rich environment to understand and interact with a much broader audience than is afforded here at Wellesley, even while they're still here in Wellesley in that small seminar room where they're sitting around a table talking to each other in the way that you imagine Wellesley students would. So one of the questions then is whether these MOOCs are really the future of education. Are they going to gobble up and dramatically transform how we teach college students, how we structure higher education from now in the foreseeable future? And I'm skeptical of that idea. If you ask me if they're the future, I'd say, well, maybe they're part of the future. The idea that we might apply technology to continue to change how we teach students is something that I'd fully agree with. And to give an example of that, I want to talk about something that preceded MOOCs, which were borrowable, open, on-demand knowledge systems, otherwise known as books. Think about it. Prior to the printing press, prior to the invention of the book, to learn something, you had to be taught individually by an instructor. Suddenly you have these books, these great things that are just repositories of knowledge, that as long as you can read, you can access. You can teach yourself anything. As Matt Damon's character said in Good Will Hunting, you could have gotten that Harvard education with $10 in late fines from your local library. The challenge is, how many of you have ever started reading a book and not finished it? My wife is a French professor here, and I sadly have a copy of Madame Bovary sitting on my bedstand that I haven't finished for a year and a half. It's just lingering there, staring at me. And the reason is, books are content, but it helps still if we have someone to assist us in guiding us through that content. If we think of a MOOC as a content delivery system, there's still a valuable role to be played for those individuals and institutions that will guide you through that content. That's fundamentally what education is all about. It's not simply about getting access to the stuff, well, that's a critical and valuable first step, and one that Wellesley can do on a much broader scale in the context of online education. But it still requires an instructor to help guide you through that material. We're not all geniuses. We can't all learn everything all on our own, and if we had to, we'd be in deep trouble. So if you see MOOCs as merely part of the future of expanding the scope of institutions of higher education, taking advantage of the fact that there are these tremendous clusters of learning and knowledge, and empowering them to spread that knowledge a little more broadly, even if in a slightly different way than they're teaching their own students, I think there's potentially great value in that. So I'll close with this final thought. This is an image of me and actually one of our video production assistants, who's also in the back of the room here, at a filming shoot one day actually on Revere Beach in Boston. And I think it's a nice image to send with. You know, you might imagine this as, two people walking off into the sunset, maybe getting ready to hit the beach with a surfboard, but instead we have a video production camera here because that's what we've been doing. So if you ask me if MOOCs are the future of education, I'll say no. If you ask me if they're part of the future of education, if you ask me part of the future of Wellesley College, I think quite possibly. But the key is to think strategically about how best to integrate them, to have specific goals, not just to be big, but to think about how we might take advantage of the properties of being big, how we might take advantage of those properties to improve the kind of teaching we do here at Wellesley, to improve the resources we're offering to our students, to improve the value of the education that we're providing, and ideally maintain that value not just while they're here at Wellesley as students, but throughout their life as their Wellesley alumni. So with that, I will stop and leave the time open for questions that anyone might have.
Will you have the technology to see, you've got 19,000 people registered, and I'm one of them, but I have not hit my go button yet. So will you, in a month, know how many people have actually taken that first lesson, taken that second lesson, and, I mean, will you be able to track that and see?
I will know that this weekend.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean that's one of the advantages of the system is there is a lot of data feedback in the system. There's a lot of ability to track what's going on basically. So that in the context of teaching the course, I might tweak exactly how I'm delivering content to students. I might change things to make things more amenable for certain kinds of students or to adjust on the basis of basically what's succeeding and what's not succeeding. So one of the goals in the development of these MOOC systems was to improve our ability to assess what we do as teachers. And so that is part of the goal, basically, to track back and get this information. Now, again, one of my goals is to get information out of my students so that I have that samples of variation to share both with my online students and my on-campus students. And the way I do that is through actually surveys I'm administering in the course. So every week I'm going to be keeping track of the data associated with what students are doing, what answers they're providing, where they're getting questions wrong, because I'm really interested in that data.
Okay, so I have not clicked on the go button. Are you going to ask me what my wingspan and my height is? I mean, are you going to collect that information from 19,000 people, hopefully?
Eventually. I mean,
okay.
Not 19,000, but even if we get it from 2,000, it's a pretty broad sample. And those kinds of data, so the component that I use in the course is something called Your Turn, where it's basically your turn to contribute something about yourself towards understanding patterns of human biological variation. They're not graded, they're entirely optional. The first one this week was basically an evolution survey. What do you know about evolution? But yeah, if you click the go button, each week you'll get asked something.
My daughter go back to the library and watch the video lecture, and if that afforded her to learn more in the classroom and do you explain what more you're doing in the classroom if you're offloading the video lectures?
Yeah, so in the past, again, because the fossil record is such a foreign topic to most people, you know, there's not a lot of high school exposure to, say, studying the human fossil record. When I taught this class in the past, by necessity, basically, I was lecturing the entire time. So I'd talk about the fossils. But now I can talk about the fossils, again, on the student's laptop in their dorm room. And then in the class, we can actually bring out casts and actually look at them and do activities with them, test hypotheses using them in front of us. We can do activities like we did today, which is basically an organized debate. Next week, we're actually going to explore bipedality in some detail. So humans, one of our odd features is that we're obligate bipeds. We walk on 2 feet, and as adults, we can pretty much only walk on 2 feet. But we all actually walk a little bit differently, and it's something that we don't really necessarily explore in great detail. But next week, my students are going to explore in great detail. We're going to walk around, and we're going to look at each other walking around, and we're going to look at the differences, and we're going to catalog those differences, and we're going to think critically about what it means to be a biped and actually how we differ in the ways in which we're bipeds. What does it mean different to walk bipedally with shoes versus barefoot? Well, we're going to walk with shoes and we're going to walk barefoot in the class. And that's the kind of sort of free-form activity that's creative and ideally goal-directed in terms of trying to have a real learning motive in mind, but that takes time and that we wouldn't have had the time to do before.
It's a fascinating talk, and I think it's clear you put a lot of resources into developing this course. Do the 19,000 students donate a little, or does the college have to justify this based on altruism, the promotional value, and the value to your 14 students?
I can't speak for the college administration really with that respect, but I do think that ultimately they would like to get some return back, because it is expensive. It's expensive to do all this video production. It's expensive for me to commit all this time. It's a lot of time. And the initial way in which that might be done is actually for students who complete the course. There's no credit associated with it, but you can get a certificate of completion, which I don't know if the college has actually figured out even what they're going to do with that, but there could be a nominal cost associated with that. So there's some return. But there's potentially other ways in which, for example, the courseware might be licensed and sold to other institutions, but those are institutional questions that I'm not necessarily involved in discussions with at this point. From my own personal standpoint, I think I would like the resources to be open and free in all contexts, basically. I think the value to the university is in this establishment and connections with its alums. You know, if you can improve your connection to your alums by, say, 10%, and if that connection is correlated with alumni giving and their connection and their involvement in the institution, I think that's a huge value, even if it's hard to put a quantifiable figure on that value.
Hi, I'm a librarian here at Wellesley, and I'm taking a MOOC from a rival institution, Coursera. And I see MOOCs as a means of spreading democratization, reason, and scientific knowledge across the world. Do you see it that way?
I think it certainly has potential in that direction. I mean, there's some things that are limiting. I mean, so the class is 19,000 students all over the world. One of the first person to comment in the discussion forums was a student from East Timor. I don't think we have any students from East Timor here on campus. That said, I mean, it's not perfect. There's still an element of privilege associated with the class in the sense that you really need a high-speed internet connection to be able to do it. You probably need to be able to speak English pretty well. There's a lot of commenters, it turns out, who speak Spanish in my class who I can kind of read Spanish and speak Spanish from high school, but I'm not really trained to do that. And they might not be able to do the class. So there are some limitations to, it's not a perfect way of reaching everyone. There are still some issues of privilege and limitation that are there.
So at this point, is there any indication that there'll be sort of WellesleyX groups actually meeting in person to discuss things? Rather than of course, at Harvard that happened. In India, there were groups, you know, with the health and numbers course that went live last year.
I think there will definitely be that. I know I'll be, eventually we're going to be organizing alumni office hours. So I'll probably be doing video office hours with alums an hour a week at some point. That might take a few weeks to get started. Within the first, actually before the course even went live, I only became aware of it when it went live, but there was already a Facebook group that had been established with a group that already had over 1,000 members in it. And you know, the first question everyone asks and the first thing everyone says about them is where you're from. So I think there will be, once people actually figure out, oh, I'm also from San Francisco, I think there will be those in-person gatherings.
Have you noticed issues
So far it has been remarkably self-moderating, which is thankful. I have a history of online blogs in that I'm a giant Cleveland Indians baseball fan, and actually was a co-moderator of a Cleveland baseball blog for a number of years before I came to Wellesley while I was in graduate school. And the issues of moderating online content and comment moderators, free-form comments, is a very difficult one. I saw just yesterday, I think, Popular Science, the magazine, ended comments on its website because it's just not worth it. There's no sort of value added. But so far, the comments have been great. In part, I think, because there's a really strong interest in people who are taking the class. And it takes some effort to take the class. It's not like just a website that you can just post random stuff on. You actually need to register and be involved.
So my question, partly it's moderating so that you don't have trolls. And I imagine that for a new endeavor, people are self-selecting coming on. You can keep that at a minimum. I was actually thinking about responsiveness. I mean, it's one thing to follow the comment section of a New York Times article, and there are 170 comments or 40. If there are 4,300 comments, I'm not going to be troubling to read through them. How do people gain benefits out of that many people?
That's going to be something that's going to be interesting to see how it develops. I mean, right now, one of my goals is to be really actually highly involved in the discussion forums. I think that's part of the value added of a place like Wellesley doing this, as opposed to a place like Harvard or MIT, where probably the faculty aren't that involved. There they have the advantage of having grad students maybe do some of that labor. I'm going to be taking a couple students out of my class on campus to help serve that role. So they'll actually get paid to do that, and it's another opportunity for them to engage the course content.
So you'll curate and highlight
Yeah.
particularly interesting students.
Yeah, and the system itself has some basically software in place to help with that as well, where you can vote up or vote down comments, you can flag comments, you can star post to follow, basically. So there's some built-in infrastructure related to that. It could be better, and I think edX is working to improve it. But there are some ways of doing that.
How much out-of-class time for your in-classroom students do you estimate that you're going to be spending watching all this extra material?
It's about 2 hours of video content a week on average. Some weeks it'll be a little bit more, some weeks it'll be a little bit less. And basically the balance I've done is I've given them a little bit less reading than I would have given them otherwise, and given them instead this online content to watch out of class, because I don't want to simply add to their labor. But in giving them less reading outside of class, it gives me more time to go through and detail some of the readings I have given them, particularly the more complex primary literature. So I think it's a trade-off that's worth making.
How are you going to do assessment for your 19,000 students? Meaning that they're not getting a credit, if you will. There's certainly some other MOOCs that I've taken. There certainly is different types of assessment.
So I'm being fairly conservative in my assessment techniques, in the sense that edX is starting to develop sort of more advanced assessment things, such as peer-reviewed grading systems, automatic grading systems of essays. Most of my stuff will basically be some kind of automatically gradable question. So there's different kinds of questions. That one that I showed you of the gorilla skull was a drag and drop, where they have to basically match the name of the bone to the specific bone itself. But multiple choice questions, true false questions, those kinds of things. So the assessment in my course, I have to say, is fairly primitive. It's not that advanced, in part because I didn't want to experiment in too many areas simultaneously. I wanted to step gingerly in that area. And my primary interest in putting together the course was in delivering content, less actually in assessment. Assessment will be sort of a secondary goal for me. For the edX folks, I think their primary interest is assessment. But so initially it'll be fairly straightforward kinds of questions. And I thought actually, in putting together the materials, that I was maybe erring on making it too easy, but feedback in the forum suggests that it's not.
Is it possible to audit? I have my own classes to teach, but I'm very interested in the content of what you're teaching.
Of course. I mean, that's the thing with the advantage of teaching on campus, obviously, is that the students are there, and they have to be there. Online, nobody has to be there. You can register for a class, and you can never, ever do anything with it. You can never click the go button. Or you can click the go button so you have access to it, and then never do anything until the final week, and then go through the entire course if you wanted, just looking at the content. So you can participate as freely as you want to, basically. The materials are there. They're not going to go away until the course is done. When the course final is done, then the materials will be archived and they won't be accessible. But while the course is running, you can jump in at any point and you can follow any of the content up to what's been released. Basically, every week new content comes live. So right now, only the first week's content is viewable. But you don't need to fully participate to actually be registered.
What kind of classes
So Wellesley's initial deal is for 4 classes. So mine is the first going live this semester. Next semester, Professor Guy Rogers from the History Department is teaching a class on Alexander the Great, and so ancient history. And then next fall, there'll be 2 classes, one being co-taught, I think, by Eugen Ko in the English department and Diego Arciniegas in theater studies on Shakespeare and Shakespearean performance. And then another one taught by Dr. Smitha Ravi Krishna, talking about global sociology. So those are the 4 initial courses. Now, there are a bunch of other people on campus who are actually using the software on campus to do more of a flipped classroom environment on campus, not as MOOCs, but simply using that course software within their own courses on campus. So that's kind of a different issue altogether. But the initial trial run is 4 classes.
I was able to have the privilege of sitting in on the teaching of the Shakespeare class yesterday with my daughter. She happened to be in that class, and I was amazed at how well it went. You know, just the level of discussion and the ease of the students. They were completely comfortable being on camera and just spoke right up, and it was amazing.
Yeah, no, it's been fun.
Some of the courses so far have been very quantitative and able to be measured by multiple choice questions. It's a little hard to do a research paper online.
Yeah.
And that's got to be a vehicle that you use in teaching students on campus.
Of course. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why my goal was never to create an equivalent class online. I see them as very different courses, and I didn't want to try and have the goal of making something that's equal in terms of what the students are getting out of it, how they're being assessed. You know, I think what we're doing here on Wellesley's campus is much better than what's going on online. I think students are learning more. I have a greater ability to assess them because I know the 14 students in my class. I know what year they are. I know what majors they are. I know what activities they do. I know a lot of information about them. So I can tailor how I address them, how I convey certain concepts to them in a very individual way. And then I meet with them in office hours for an extended period of time. You know, if I give, 45 minutes a week to each student, let's say, I can't do that with 19,000 students, obviously. Like I said, I have an infant at home. It's not going to happen. So that's one of the challenges, is figuring out actually how best to do assessment. And there are, like I said, edX is developing, and other online vendors, assessments for things like essays that are more creative and organic. I, again, didn't want to quite go there. In my class, students are going to have the opportunity to write free verse responses like that. They're just not going to be graded. I posted the first one this morning, it's a thought question for the weekend idea. And people will contribute. People do it even if it's not graded because they're interested in it. And people will respond to what people say and vote people up and vote people down. So it's not an assessment in the sense that I'm grading them on it, but they're participating and other people are evaluating them.
You must be envious of the Shakespeare professors if they have a whole year's lead time when you just started in May. And you were saying that you assigned to a student perhaps 2 hours of video to view during a week. What do you think is your production time as a presenter, along with your videographer, for every hour of video output? What sort of work time does that represent, do you think?
It's a fair amount, and it's more now because it's the first time that Wellesley is doing it. So part of Wellesley's goal in doing these 4 courses is to improve their own internal capabilities for producing this kind of content. One of the goals of edX is to produce very high quality content and to prioritize quality as a means of increasing retention and increasing student engagement in that online environment. So my head video producer, his background is in documentary filmmaking, and the sort of style of it is in that kind of documentary style. But it does take a lot of time. I mean, to give you an indication of the workflow, basically, obviously, there's a lot of time for me putting it together and taking what would be sort of a 13-week on-campus class where each week we go through various topics and breaking it down into 240 5-minute modules, video modules. So there's a lot of time there. Thinking about what I'm going to say in each of those 5-minute modules, filming them sometimes when it's a good day, when I've had a lot of sleep the night before on a first take, when the baby has not been very cooperative, on a 4th or 5th take. Then, of course, it goes through primary editing. Then I comment on that and add in images and things like that. Then it goes through secondary editing. Then it has a transcript that's recorded from it from a contractor. The transcript has to be edited. And then it goes live. So, I mean, it's hard to figure out because it goes across a lot of different people. On my end, as a faculty member, it's probably 6 hours for every 1 hour of video content. So it's a huge amount of time. It's a huge commitment, again, from a faculty standpoint. And it's Not something I would recommend embarking on lightly, but again, knowing that it was going to be a lot of students, these first 48 hours have been pretty overwhelming in terms of actually seeing these students actually start talking and doing things. So there's a lot of interesting residual value from a faculty perspective, let's say.
And is it all done? All the pieces are done?
No, everything is not done. That would be nice if it was. About 80% of the filming is done now. Editing still has to take place on a lot of that, and the course construction is still ongoing.
It's written in your head.
Most of it is written in my head.
An earlier version of mass outreach were the great courses that were on DVD,
Yeah.
for example, and they basically live forever. So you mentioned that once your course is over, the archive will be inaccessible. Is that true of every MOOC?
I don't know how other platforms do it. edX basically, once there's a little bit of a grace period after the final exam, but then it basically goes dormant. And those materials are all still there. So edX, I think they have courses that are now entering their third iteration. And, ideally from Wellesley's perspective, I hope that my course gets taught again. And in teaching it again, there won't be nearly as much production time associated with it because most of the content will be produced. It'll matter tweaking and adjusting and those kinds of things. So to really recoup the value, obviously, I think Wellesley would want to teach these classes 6 or 7 or 8 times potentially, to have that infrastructure built basically and then to just build off that from year to year.
What are some of the controversies that are in the classroom, and was it hard to think about translating it to a MOOC setting?
Well, one of the things that I wasn't sure about going into it is teaching about human evolution. What kind of conversations might erupt in the forums around, creationism and evolution, for example. I'm kind of oddly positioned maybe in terms of people who study human evolution in that my father is a just retired Presbyterian pastor. My grandfather was a pastor his entire life. My mother-in-law, it turns out, is an ordained Presbyterian minister. So I have an interesting background within the church. But my dad is just an example, actually, for the past several years, basically ever since I started graduate school, has been teaching adult education classes related to the integration of science and faith so that hopefully I was well positioned to deal with those situations if they erupted within the classroom environment, the online class especially. As an anthropologist, I tend to be fairly self-critical in terms of recognizing that there's lots of different ways of experiencing and understanding the world and developing knowledge in the world. Science is a great one in terms of a lot of its properties, and it works well for a lot of different questions, but it's not the only means by any way. So I've tried to deal with that, but so far, there hasn't been much of that. There's a few little side threads going, but they've been actually very friendly. What I've found most often in terms of the discussion so far is actually people who are saying, I've grown up a creationist, or I grew up in a high school where there was no biology, no evolution taught, and I'm interested in filling the gap. So that's rewarding to see. Hopefully that keeps up for the next 12 weeks.
I'm a little confused about the mechanisms that in the classrooms and campus you have reading to do. With the video productions, is it pretty passive? You have to answer questions and so forth, but you have reading expected from the online students?
The students have online readings too. So, what I've tried to do is utilize exclusively open access reading content, actually. So the way the courseware works, basically, there'll be maybe some lectures, there'll be readings associated with those lectures, there'll be questions associated with that. And so it'll all be sort of this sequenced series of encounters for the students, where they might go through the lecture, reading related to the lecture, questions related to assessing what they got out of those contents. And it is certainly more passive than a classroom environment. Simply the fact that someone's taking it staring at a screen makes it more passive. So the goal in terms of that high quality of production is to increase the level of engagement and make it less passive in some ways. Exactly. One of the sort of nifty features that edX has is you can actually also watch the lectures sped up at 1.5 times speed or 2 times speed, which I love because it helps me edit them a lot more quickly. But it's another way of, I think, acknowledging the fact that your students are going to be more passive. Again, it's one of the reasons I don't think they can ever fundamentally be the same thing.
But registration says it's going to be 4 to 6 hours a week.
Yeah.
You register for the class on.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the edX has the text when you're speaking, so then for
Yeah.
people who are not audio, so it appeals to different learners.
Yeah. So the transcript is right there. The transcript, if you click it, you can search. It'll take you anywhere in the video, basically wherever you've clicked. So there are a couple of really nice features to the how to do it. Again, I think emphasizing the quality is really important in terms of online environments because of that passive nature. You really need to try and hook the student into it. Any other questions?
Can I access the lecture again? Haven't hit the go button. Can I access this like as a podcast, so I'm just getting audio?
You can download it as an MP4 file, so you can then listen to it as anything. So you can, so you can move it around. You can download the transcript and have the transcript as a text document. So there's some nice features to it. All right, well, thank you all very much, and enjoy the remainder of your weekend here at Wellesley.